Chapter 7 of The House on the Borderland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Alan Winterowd. The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson. Chapter 7 The Attack. I spent some time puzzling how to strengthen the study door. Finally, I went down to the kitchen, and with some trouble brought up several heavy pieces of timber. These I wedged up slantwise against it from the floor, nailing them top and bottom. For half an hour I worked hard, and at last got it shored to my mind. Then, feeling easier, I resumed my coat, which I had laid aside, and proceeded to attend to one or two matters before returning to the tower. It was whilst thus employed that I heard a fumbling at the door, and the latch was tried. Keeping silence, I waited. Soon I heard several of the creatures outside. They were grunting to one another softly. Then for a moment there was quietness. Suddenly there sounded a quick low grunt, and the door creaked under a tremendous pressure. It would have burst inward but for the supports I had placed. The strain ceased as quickly as it had begun, and there was more talk. Presently one of the things squealed softly, and I heard the sound of others approaching. There was a short confabulation, then again silence, and I realized that they had called several more to assist. Feeling that now was the supreme moment, I stood ready with my rifle presented. If the door gave, I would at least slay as many as possible. Again came the low signal, and once more the door creaked under a huge force. For a minute perhaps the pressure was kept up, and I waited nervously, expecting each moment to see the door come down with a crash. But no, the struts held, and the attempt proved abortive. Then followed more of their horrible grunting talk, and whilst it lasted I thought I distinguished the noise of fresh arrivals. After a long discussion, during which the door was several times shaken, they became quiet once more, and I knew that they were going to make a third attempt to break it down. I was almost in despair. The props had been severely tried in the two previous attacks, and I was sorely afraid that this would prove too much for them. At that moment, like an inspiration, a thought flashed into my troubled brain. Instantly, for it was no time to hesitate, I ran from the room, and up stair after stair. This time, it was not to one of the towers that I went, but out onto the flat, leaded roof itself. Once there, I raced across to the parapet that walls it round, and looked down. As I did so, I heard the short, grunted signal, and even up there, caught the crying of the door under the assault. There was not a moment to lose, and leaning over, I aimed quickly and fired. The report rang sharply, and, almost blending with it, came the loud splut of the bullet striking its mark. From below rose a shrill wail, and the door ceased its groaning. Then, as I took my weight from off the parapet, a huge piece of the stone coping slid from under me, and fell with a crash among the disorganized throng beneath. Several horrible shrieks quavered through the night air, and then I heard a sound of scampering feet. Cautiously I looked over. In the moonlight I could see the great coping stone lying right across the threshold of the door. I thought I saw something under it, several things, white, but I could not be sure. And so a few minutes passed. As I stared, I saw something come round out of the shadow of the house. It was one of the things. It went up to the stone silently, and bent down. I was unable to see what it did. In a minute it stood up. It had something in its talons, which it put to its mouth and tore at. For the moment I did not realize. Then slowly I comprehended. The thing was stooping again. It was horrible. I started to load my rifle. When I looked again, the monster was tugging at the stone, moving it to one side. I leant the rifle on the coping, and pulled the trigger. The brute collapsed, on its face, and kicked slightly. Simultaneously, almost, with the report, I heard another sound, that of breaking glass. Waiting only to recharge my weapon, I ran from the roof, and down the first 2 flights of stairs. Here I paused to listen. As I did so, there came another tinkle of falling glass. It appeared to come from the floor below. Excitedly, I sprang down the steps, and, guided by the rattle of the window sash, reached the door of one of the empty bedrooms, at the back of the house. I thrust it open. The room was but dimly illuminated by the moonlight, most of the light being blotted out by moving figures at the window. Even as I stood, one crawled through into the room. Leveling my weapon, I fired point blank at it, filling the room with a deafening bang. When the smoke cleared, I saw that the room was empty, and the window free. The room was much lighter. The night air blew in coldly through the shattered panes. Down below, in the night, I could hear a soft moaning and a confused murmur of swine voices. Stepping to one side of the window, I reloaded, and then stood there waiting. Presently I heard a scuffling noise. From where I stood in the shadow I could see without being seen. Nearer came the sounds, and then I saw something come up above the sill and clutch at the broken window frame. It caught a piece of the woodwork, and now I could make out that it was a hand and arm. A moment later the face of one of the swine creatures rose into view. Then, before I could use my rifle or do anything, there came a sharp crack, crack, and the window frame gave way under the weight of the thing. Next instant a squashing thud and a loud outcry told me that it had fallen to the ground. With a savage hope that it had been killed, I went to the window. The moon had gone behind a cloud, so that I could see nothing, though a steady hum of jabbering, just beneath where I stood, indicated that there were several more of the brutes close at hand. As I stood there, looking down, I marveled how it had been possible for the creatures to climb so far, for the wall is comparatively smooth, while the distance to the ground must be at least 80 feet. All at once, as I bent peering, I saw something indistinctly that cut the gray shadow of the house side with a black line. It passed the window to the left, at a distance of about 2 feet. Then I remembered that it was a gutter pipe that had been put there some years ago to carry off the rainwater. I had forgotten about it. I could see now how the creatures had managed to reach the window. Even as the solution came to me, I heard a faint slithering, scratching noise, and knew that another of the brutes was coming. I waited some odd moments, then leant out of the window and felt the pipe. To my delight I found that it was quite loose, and I managed, using the rifle barrel as a crowbar, to lever it out from the wall. I worked quickly. Then, taking hold with both hands, I wrenched the whole concern away and hurled it down, with the thing still clinging to it, into the garden. For a few minutes longer I waited there, listening. But after the first general outcry I heard nothing. I knew now there was no more reason to fear an attack from this quarter. I had removed the only means of reaching the window, and, as none of the other windows had any adjacent water pipes to tempt the climbing powers of the monsters, I began to feel more confident of escaping their clutches. Leaving the room, I made my way down to the study. I was anxious to see how the door had withstood the test of that last assault. Entering, I lit 2 of the candles, and then turned to the door. One of the large props had been displaced, and on that side the door had been forced inward some 6 inches. It was providential that I had managed to drive the brutes away just when I did. And that coping stone! I wondered vaguely how I had managed to dislodge it. I had not noticed it loose as I took my shot, and then, as I stood up, it had slipped away from beneath me. I felt that I owed the dismissal of the attacking force more to its timely fall than to my rifle. Then the thought came that I had better seize this chance to shore up the door again. It was evident that the creatures had not returned since the fall of the coping stone, but who was to say how long they would keep away? There and then I set to at repairing the door, working hard and anxiously. First I went down to the basement, and, rummaging round, found several pieces of heavy oak planking. With these I returned to the study, and, having removed the props, placed the planks up against the door. Then I nailed the heads of the struts to these, and, driving them well home at the bottoms, nailed them again there. Thus I made the door stronger than ever, for now it was solid with the backing of boards, and would, I felt convinced, stand a heavier pressure than hitherto, without giving away. After that I lit the lamp which I had brought from the kitchen, and went down to have a look at the lower windows. Now that I had seen an instance of the strength the creatures possessed, I felt considerable anxiety about the windows on the ground floor, in spite of the fact that they were so strongly barred. I went first to the buttery, having a vivid remembrance of my last adventure there. The place was chilly, and the wind, sighing in through the broken glass, produced an eerie note. Apart from the general air of dismalness, the place was as I had left it on the night before. Going up to the window, I examined the bars closely, noting as I did so their comfortable thickness. Still, as I looked more intently, it seemed to me that the middle bar was bent slightly from the straight. Yet it was but trifling, and it might have been so for years. I had never before noticed them particularly. I put my hand through the broken window and shook the bar. It was as firm as a rock. Perhaps the creatures had tried to start it, and finding it beyond their power, ceased from the effort. After that, I went round to each of the windows in turn, examining them with careful attention, but nowhere else could I trace anything to show that there had been any tampering. Having finished my survey, I went back to the study and poured myself out a little brandy, then to the tower to watch. Chapter 7. Recording by Alan Winterowd. Boomcoach.blogspot.com. Chapter 8 of The House on the Borderland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Alan Winterowd. The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson. Chapter 8 After the Attack. It was now about 3 a.m., and presently the eastern sky began to pale with the coming of dawn. Gradually the day came, and by its light I scanned the gardens earnestly, but nowhere could I see any signs of the brutes. I leaned over and glanced down at the foot of the wall to see whether the body of the thing I had shot the night before was still there. It was gone. I supposed that the others of the monsters had removed it during the night. Then I went down onto the roof, and crossed over to the gap from which the coping stone had fallen. Reaching it, I looked over. Yes, there was the stone as I had seen it last, but there was no appearance of anything beneath it, nor could I see the creatures I had killed after its fall. Evidently they had also been taken away. I turned and went down to my study. There I sat down wearily. I was thoroughly tired. It was quite light now, though the sun's rays were not as yet perceptibly hot. A clock chimed the hour of 4. I awoke with a start and looked round hurriedly. The clock in the corner indicated that it was 3 o'clock. It was already afternoon. I must have slept for nearly 11 hours. With a jerky movement, I sat forward in the chair and listened. The house was perfectly silent. Slowly I stood up and yawned. I felt desperately tired still, and sat down again, wondering what it was that had waked me. It must have been the clock striking, I concluded presently, and was commencing to doze off, when a sudden noise brought me back once more to life. It was the sound of a step, as of a person moving cautiously down the corridor toward my study. In an instant I was on my feet and grasping my rifle. Noiselessly I waited. Had the creatures broken in whilst I slept? Even as I questioned, the steps reached my door, halted momentarily, and then continued down the passage. Silently I tiptoed to the door and peeped out. Then I experienced such a feeling of relief as must a reprieved criminal. It was my sister. She was going towards the stairs. I stepped into the hall, and was about to call her when it occurred to me that it was very queer she should have crept past my door in that stealthy manner. I was puzzled, and for one brief moment the thought occupied my mind that it was not she, but some fresh mystery of the house. Then, as I caught a glimpse of her old petticoat, the thought passed as quickly as it had come, and I half laughed. There could be no mistaking that ancient garment. Yet I wondered what she was doing, and, remembering her condition of mind on the previous day, I felt it might be best to follow quietly, taking care not to alarm her, and see what she was going to do. If she behaved rationally, well and good; if not, I should have to take steps to restrain her. I could run no unnecessary risks under the danger that threatened us. Quickly I reached the head of the stairs, and paused a moment. Then I heard a sound that sent me leaping down at a mad rate. It was the rattle of bolts being unshot. That foolish sister of mine was actually unbarring the back door. Just as her hand was on the last bolt, I reached her. She had not seen me, and the first thing she knew I had hold of her arm. She glanced up quickly, like a frightened animal, and screamed aloud. "Come, Mary," I said, sternly. "What is the meaning of this nonsense? Do you mean to tell me you don't understand the nature, that you try to throw our 2 lives away in this fashion?" To this, she replied nothing, only trembled, violently, gasping and sobbing, as though in the last extremity of fear. Through some minutes, I reasoned with her, pointed out the need for caution, and asking her to be brave. There was little to be afraid of now, I explained, and I tried to believe that I spoke the truth, but she must be sensible, and not attempt to leave the house for a few days. At last, I ceased in despair. It was no use talking to her; she was obviously not quite herself for the time being. Finally, I told her she had better go to her room, if she could not behave rationally. Still, she took not any notice; so, without any more ado, I picked her up in my arms, and carried her there. At first, she screamed wildly, but had relapsed into silent trembling by the time I reached the stairs. Arriving at her room, I laid her upon the bed. She lay there quietly enough, neither speaking nor sobbing, just shaking in a very ague of fear. I took a rug from a chair near by, and spread it over her. I could do nothing more for her, and so crossed to where Pepper lay in a big basket. My sister had taken charge of him since his wound, to nurse him, for it had proved more severe than I had thought, and I was pleased to note that, in spite of her state of mind, she had looked after the old dog carefully. Stooping, I spoke to him, and in reply he licked my hand feebly. He was too ill to do more. Then, going to the bed, I bent over my sister, and asked her how she felt, but she only shook the more, and, much as it pained me, I had to admit that my presence seemed to make her worse. And so I left her, locking the door and pocketing the key. It seemed to be the only course to take. The rest of the day I spent between the tower and my study. For food, I brought up a loaf from the pantry, and on this and some claret I lived for that day. What a long, weary day it was! If only I could have gone out into the gardens, as is my wont, I should have been content enough; but to be cooped in this silent house, with no companion save a mad woman and a sick dog, was enough to prey upon the nerves of the hardiest. And out in the tangled shrubberies that surrounded the house lurked, for all I could tell, those infernal swine creatures waiting their chance. Was ever a man in such straits? Once in the afternoon, and again later, I went to visit my sister. The second time, I found her tending Pepper, but at my approach she slid over, unobtrusively, to the far corner, with a gesture that saddened me beyond belief. Poor girl! Her fear cut me intolerably, and I would not intrude on her unnecessarily. She would be better, I trusted, in a few days. Meanwhile, I could do nothing, and I judged it still needful, hard as it seemed, to keep her confined to her room. One thing there was that I took for encouragement: she had eaten some of the food I had taken to her on my first visit. And so the day passed. As the evening drew on, the air grew chilly, and I began to make preparations for passing a second night in the tower, taking up 2 additional rifles, and a heavy ulster. The rifles I loaded, and laid alongside my other, as I intended to make things warm for any of the creatures who might show during the night. I had plenty of ammunition, and I thought to give the brutes such a lesson as should show them the uselessness of attempting to force an entrance. After that, I made the round of the house again, paying particular attention to the props that supported the study door. Then, feeling that I had done all that lay in my power to ensure our safety, I returned to the tower, calling in on my sister and Pepper for a final visit on the way. Pepper was asleep, but woke as I entered, and wagged his tail in recognition. I thought he seemed slightly better. My sister was lying on the bed, though whether asleep or not I was unable to tell, and thus I left them. Reaching the tower, I made myself as comfortable as circumstances would permit, and settled down to watch through the night. Gradually, darkness fell, and soon the details of the gardens were merged into shadows. During the first few hours, I sat alert, listening for any sound that might help to tell me if anything were stirring down below. It was far too dark for my eyes to be of much use. Slowly the hours passed, without anything unusual happening, and the moon rose, showing the gardens apparently empty and silent. And so, through the night, without disturbance or sound. Toward morning, I began to grow stiff and cold, with my long vigil. Also,